Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Friday, June 12th, 2020. And less than 3 weeks after George Floyd was killed by a police officer in Minneapolis, the ensuing protests are producing some tangible change. And unlike the outcry after a mass shooting, and when you think about it, we haven't had a significant one of those in a while now, the call for thoughts and prayers and the inaction, the studied inaction that follows that, present a model. And based on that comparison, we're seeing a lot more action and a lot more action proposed related to the underlying issues than we see from the repeated incidents of gun violence. So when we look across the country, starting in Minnesota, well, the state legislature is convening a special session starting today to consider a package of bills aimed at overhauling policing and redressing policies that have led to systemic economic inequality. And this inequality is significant because in too much of the media coverage, as we'll air out here shortly, the focus has been on race. And this is race and class that is in conflict, that is being protested. And we are seeing that some elected officials get that message. So Governor Tim Walz, the Democrat in Minnesota, says that his state will change the way we do policing. Minnesota will change what accountability looks like, and Minnesota will start to lift up those voices that for too long have felt that they haven't been heard. Now, there is a Republican majority in the state Senate, but in the lower house, it's a Democratic majority. So it'll be interesting to see how the Republicans exercise their power as these efforts move forward. Now, we're hearing some Republicans say that they have been stirred by, this is a leader of the state Senate, Paul Gazelka. He said that Floyd's arrest and death stirred something in my soul that I would call righteous anger. Well, just how righteous will you be, Mr. Gazelka? We understand that they will get on board to ban chokeholds, for example, but will they permit measures like restoring voter rights to felons? Now, none of the reforms in Minnesota so far go to the extent of defunding or dismantling police departments, but the package would encourage alternatives to current policing by giving money to groups that step into conflicts without calling law enforcement, or to pair up more social workers with officers on calls. Now today, New York Governor Cuomo signed a package of bills targeting police misconduct, some of which have languished for years in Albany and faced opposition from police unions, including a ban on the use of chokeholds, as well as repeal of the decades-old statute that has allowed police to keep disciplinary records of their officers secret. Cuomo also announced he would issue an executive order requiring New York's 500 local police departments and agencies to develop plans to modernize their tactics with community input or risk becoming ineligible for state funding. In New Mexico, Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham said the state legislature could require body cameras for all law enforcement agencies during an upcoming special session originally scheduled for budget matters. In Ohio, Mike DeWine, a Republican governor, announced that he had directed a state task force to draw up new standards for how the police respond to mass protests. Massachusetts lawmakers are working on legislation to ban chokeholds, enhance police oversight, obligate officers to intervene if a fellow officer is using inappropriate force. And as you know, that to me is a fundamental required to really reform police departments from the inside out. Now, I want to admit and acknowledge that these are steps forward, but it's a long way to real fundamental change. Because you can ban a chokehold, but if an officer who uses one is protected by his or her union, and never faces real accountability for that, then these become meaningless new laws. Also, I'm pleased to see that many states and jurisdictions are pulling cops out of the schools, and adding police officers to schools has led to more students in the prison pipeline, as issues that would have been resolved through a restorative justice process or just a disciplinary act like a suspension become a police issue. So Minneapolis, Seattle, Portland, Oregon have all promised to remove officers. Oakland, California expressed support on Wednesday for eliminating the district's internal police force. The Denver Board of Education voted unanimously to end its police contract. In Louisville, they have voted to ban no-knock warrants after the killing of Breonna Taylor. The Metro Council in Louisville on Thursday unanimously voted to ban no-knock warrants. Mayor Greg Fisher said he would sign the ban into law. They named it Breonna's Law. It also sets new guidelines for other types of search warrants, according to a statement from the council. Requires that cops have their body cameras on when conducting a search. So many of these, and related to that, advocates are pleased at the new regulation, but they're also demanding that charges for the 3 police officers follow in short order. Those are the cops who busted into Breonna Taylor's home and when her boyfriend shot at them because they were in plain clothes. They didn't identify themselves as police. They didn't say, "We've got a warrant." And he stood his ground. The way white guys do. And as a result, his girlfriend is dead, and so far the cops have not in any way been sanctioned. Perhaps they've been suspended. I should say that I'm not sure if there was some administrative move, but they have not been charged. So here in San Francisco, Mayor London Breed has unveiled a 4-point blueprint for police reforms, and the Board of Supervisors, I believe, is likely to pass them. One is to separate out functions that police are doing today so that emergency calls about homelessness and mental health issues, any kind of non-criminal activities, would be responded to by trained and unarmed professionals who would be better equipped to handle situations like neighborhood disputes, school discipline interventions, or a behavioral health crisis. The reforms would additionally fortify accountability policies, ban the use of military-grade weapons, and divert funding to communities of color. And these funding moves fall under the broad designation of defunding the police. And yesterday I spent some time and quoted liberally from the David Sirota commentary about the way many white pundits, including armchair pundits on Facebook, have been saying, "Oh, defund the police, that's a bad slogan." Well, a new poll shows that Americans are reacting and that views are shifting because of the protests that were launched by the police killing of George Floyd. Now, predictably, 45% of all Americans say that law and order is the most important thing, even if it means limiting peaceful protest. But 44% say the right to protest is the most important thing to ensure, even if there's some incidents of violence. And this comes from a new Axios Ipsos poll that I just received a summary of. And related to violence from the protests, 84% of the protests of the past 2.5 weeks, there have been more than 1,400 of them nationwide, 84% have been completely nonviolent. Only 16% are described as protests with observable violence. So I think that is an important context for the views that are summarized in this poll. Now, while most Americans oppose the phrase defund the police, 89% believe that at any kind of a police interaction, officers must provide civilians with the badge number, name, and a reason for the stop. 78% support community oversight in policing, including a police commission of civilians. 76% support proposals to move some money currently going to police budgets into better officer training, local programs for homelessness, mental health assistance, and domestic violence. 76%. Now, that is a form of defunding the police. Now, the phrase itself draws support from 34% of all Americans, 57% of African Americans. And so it does have resonance. And I freely admit that objectively, as a political message consultant myself, I'm kind of retired from that, but I've done that on political campaigns for years. I recognize that it's not the best phrase from the point of view of selling it through to the general public and having a lower profile related to attacks from Trump and the right. But it's the phrase that came from the protesters. They didn't ask me. They didn't ask you. Interesting article under the byline of Aline Brown and Mara Vistendahl at The Intercept today, noting that during the protests that spiked into fires and some violence in Minneapolis, that neighborhoods developed their own kind of watch groups, some of whom would block the streets with checkpoints and make sure that outsiders and people with license plates that were not local weren't coming into their own neighborhoods. And there are cases where, for example, members of the American Indian Movement Patrol, AIM, confronted 3 white teenagers from Wisconsin who were looting a liquor store in Minneapolis. And so there is a seed here for replacing police with local neighborhood activists. And when it comes to defending your own property and that of your neighbors, I believe this can be conducted in a reasonable way. But we also have to be wary of vigilante groups that set up. And if, for example, all of the neighbors are white, this can extend some of the concerns that people have. So here's a quote from Tony Williams, a 27-year-old Minneapolis police abolitionist. He said, look, a lot of these neighborhood patrols are predominantly white, not all of them. And if those white folks haven't dealt with their own racism, their own internalized white supremacy, then they can very easily turn into a vigilante justice group. I think the idea is a kernel that could evolve into an effective form of safety in Minneapolis, and they are keeping people safe right now. But I also think they're going to require a lot of political education and a lot of dedication on the part of organizers and members of these groups to make sure that they do more good than harm. And I think those are wise words. But as we are looking to alternatives of the uniformed ranks of today's police organizations that operate with brutality, with a racist intent, and with impunity, I think these are ideas that deserve to be considered. Meanwhile, these are much more symbolic moves. But after statues of Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis have been either ripped down by protesters or removed in a more orderly fashion by government officials, we heard Trump say that he won't even consider renaming military bases in the U.S. that have been longstanding and named after Confederate military officers. So Congresswoman Yvette Clarke will introduce the Honoring Real Patriots Act, which will rename military bases named for any individual who took up arms against the United States during the Civil War. The bill requires the Secretary of Defense to change the names of the bases no later than a year after the bill is enacted, and it would impact Fort Pickett, Fort Hill, Fort Lee, all in Virginia, Fort Bragg in North Carolina, Fort Benning and Fort Gordon in Georgia, Fort Polk and Camp Beauregard in Louisiana, Fort Hood in Texas, and Fort Rucker in Alabama. And I know that there are many black and brown service members who have been either trained or based at these installations, and they have long bristled at having to daily see the name of people who they consider to be enemies of their ethnicity and enemies of the United States. So I mentioned that the issues of class and race, I think, are front and center. And while the looting in many cases is, it's hard to explain, and I personally can't justify it, I do understand that people who were unemployed before COVID and who were stuck at home with little or no income, people who were not, employed with an employer and a W-2 who didn't qualify for the unemployment coverage, people who didn't receive unemployment they were entitled to. And when you look at the long-running wealth and income division in the United States, there are many issues of class that are driving the protests that we have seen over the last 3 weeks. And Norman Solomon, my longtime friend at Common Dreams Today, notes that the corporate media has been focusing on deadly police mistreatment of black people. The coverage is far from comprehensive on the subject of racism in the criminal justice system. And he says we're still hearing very little about the routine violations of basic rights in courtrooms and behind bars. But he says, what about economic cruelty as compared to racial cruelty? He says, media outlets routinely detour around reasons why African Americans and other people of color are so disproportionately poor, and as a result of poverty are dying much younger than white people. The media experts bypass confronting how the wealthy gain more wealth and large corporations reap more profits at the expense of poor and middle-income people. He says the stats are grim. For every black person killed by police, vastly more are dying because of such conditions as a threadbare safety net, a lack of adequate employment, and scant access to health care or social services. News media habitually tiptoe around deadly realities of economic oppression that are hidden in plain sight. And I think in part that's because they feel it's offensive to their advertisers, who are promoting conspicuous consumption as if everybody in America can afford the products that are peddled in the breaks in the news cable coverage, the cable news coverage. Here's a quote from Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib. When we say defund police, what we mean is people are dying and we need to invest in people's livelihoods instead. And get this, in Detroit, they spent almost $300 million on police last year and $9 million on health. Tlaib says this is systematic oppression in numbers. So I think it is important to consider class alongside race as important issues that need to be addressed. So in Seattle, the CHAZ, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, remains in place today, occupied by protesters. And the mayor, Jenny Durkin, defends what's going on there. She said it was the people's right to challenge authority and their government. It's not terrorism, it's patriotism, she said. We do not need anyone, including the president, to try to sow further divide, further mistrust, and misinformation. And yesterday we covered the president's tweets threatening basically like he personally was going to come into Seattle and kick the protesters out if Governor Inslee and Mayor Durkin did not take action. So the other thing we're learning is that the police chief, her name is Best, I think Carolyn Best, she is still a little bit, let's say she's not on the same page. because after all, it was her precinct office or installation that has been boarded up in the zone that the protesters have set up. And she told Good Morning America today that, her name is Carmen Best, I'm sorry. We did not abandon the precinct, but we had to remove personnel for a short period of time. I don't get involved in the politics. I let the politicians do that, she said. But it's clear that she's not completely on board with the Chaz zone, and in particular the impact on her police precinct there. In an unusual twist, and you know Trump is he's always angry at somebody, right? But lately he's been getting more and more pissed at Fox News because they don't just kiss his ass the way Foxy Friends does. So Harris Faulkner, who is an African-American and female anchor who I'm not familiar with, she got a one-on-one interview with Trump in Dallas yesterday, where he had gone to stump for some meaningless talk about police that was boycotted by, it was boycotted by the mayor, who was too busy to participate, but the African-American sheriff and the black police chief were not even invited to Trump's little media forum. So Harris Faulkner really pressed Trump. She said, you look at me. I'm a black woman. I'm a mom. You've talked about it, but we haven't seen you come out and be the consoler in this instance. And the tweets, she said, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. Well, Faulkner, who has defended Trump against critics in the past, then said, why those words? And it reduced Trump to the kind of babble that he's become somewhat infamous for. He coughed up a word salad to say that, it's an expression I've heard over the years. Faulkner interrupted. Do you know where it comes from? I think Philadelphia, Trump said, the mayor of Philly. No, it comes from 1967, the racist Miami police chief, whose name was Walter Headley, who had declared war on criminals and said that they would use shotguns and dogs in black neighborhoods. We don't mind being accused of police brutality. And Headley launched this phrase, I've let the word filter down that when the looting starts, the shooting starts. So Trump, of course, hemmed and hawed and said he'd been misunderstood. He's always the victim, And he said that, his statement could be taken two ways. And that he knew that. One is that it's simply a statement of fact, and the other is that it is perceived as a threat. And he basically said, if he thought most people see it that way, that it was a statement of fact, he said, I think they see it both ways. And, of course, he's good at the both ways argument because, they're good people. Like in Charlottesville, good people on both sides. So what to do about Colin Kaepernick? As we saw Democratic leaders put on their, Kunte scarves. That was an idea of Karen Bass, by the way, the chair of the Black Caucus. It was not well received by a lot of people. I don't really have much objection to it. But we saw all of the Democratic leaders take a knee and hold it for 8 minutes and 45 seconds in honor of the death of George Floyd. And the NFL has now admitted, without naming Cap, that they were wrong to stifle the protests under the repeated tweeting threats of the president a few years back. And so some people are advocating for the NFL to rehire Colin Kaepernick. And on principle, I support that. It is complicated because he did enter into some sort of a multi-million-dollar settlement of his claim of being blackballed just last year. We don't know the terms of that deal. That it did lead to some workouts that were not quite tryouts, but no team offered him a contract. And with the different tone being struck by Roger Goodell, the top dog there at the NFL, there are many African-American players who are calling for a team to hire Kaepernick. Now, we don't know the dimensions of what the NFL season might be this year. That has not been announced. And I want to share with you a Facebook post from an old pal of mine who is a conservative and a Trump supporter, and as he says here, he doesn't support taking a knee. He says, as far as I am concerned, anyone is entitled to peacefully protest based on a cause they are a true believer. I do not agree with Kaepernick or any athlete's method of kneeling during the national anthem. That's fine, Tony. You can have that opinion. I don't agree with you. I think that it's a very justifiable move. It's not particularly disruptive. It's highly symbolic. But Tony goes on, and he's a football fan, and I'm not, by the way. Let's stipulate that before we go any further. He says, as far as giving Kaepernick his job back, he doesn't want his job back. He was a backup quarterback, and he only wants a starting QB job. He was offered a job in the NFL and the XFL, but he wasn't offered a starting job, and the salary offer was too low. I don't know those details. I didn't know of any offer as a backup in the NFL. Lastly, he says Kaepernick is a backup quarterback at best. Now, this is a football evaluation, and I'm not qualified to make it. He said once the entire league figured out how to defend his style of quarterbacking, he was totally ineffective. Why is that? Because he can't throw a deep pass to save his life. Sure, he throws hard, but that is it. Look at all your successful QBs in the league. Finesse is the name of the game, and being able to throw deep with accuracy is imperative. Kaepernick has neither. So if he is hired back on a token basis, and even giving a starting position and he loses 8 games in a row and they pull him out, will that be a satisfactory outcome? I'm not an NFL fan, so I'll leave you to answer that question yourselves. Yesterday, I shared with you that Amazon, followed by Microsoft and IBM, have announced that they're essentially suspending the sale of their facial recognition systems to law enforcement, and that they want federal regulation of this whole system. But an interesting piece at BuzzFeed today, amid the pop culture and listicle articles, declares that police departments are using software already that can track and identify people in crowds from surveillance footage, often with little to no public oversight or knowledge. Dozens of American cities are using BriefCam, which sells software that allows police to comb through surveillance footage to monitor protests, enforce social distancing, and almost all of these cities have hosted protests in the last 2.5, almost 3 weeks now. Some of the cities, like New Orleans and St. Paul, using BriefCam, have been the site of extreme police violence. Authorities in Chicago, Boston, Detroit, Denver, Doral, Florida, Hartford, Connecticut, and Santa Fe County, New Mexico, also have acquired the technology. And Oregon Senator Ron Wyden raised concerns earlier today. This product appears to offer exactly the kind of indiscriminate surveillance that makes so many Americans concerned about government use of facial recognition technology. Congress should step in and block the use of facial recognition by police in this manner until there are ironclad rules to protect against inaccurate, discriminatory algorithms and misuse. This company should be held responsible for any and all harm that springs from misidentifications. And we know that is a serious flaw in the technology to date. So this system was founded in 2007 by researchers at Hebrew University, and they are now owned by the camera company Canon. And this Israeli-based operation sells a system called Protect and Insights that lets police and private companies filter hours of closed-circuit TV and home surveillance and create excerpts for a few relevant moments. So it sounds pretty sophisticated. This month, BriefCam launched a new proximity identification feature, which it marketed as a way to combat the pandemic. The company claimed it could gauge the distance between individuals, detect who is wearing a mask, who isn't, and identify crowds and bottlenecks. And that's a question that occurred to me as I was reviewing this article. How do they deal with the widespread use of face masks? It does obscure the key features that facial recognition uses to identify people. Well, over the past week, there's been a lot of back and forth over the publication by the New York Times of an op-ed by Senator Tom Cotton, the Arkansas Republican, and a knuckle-dragger, a military veteran of Iraq, whose op-ed was headlined by the editors at the Times, "Send in the Troops." And we've learned since that the editorial department of the Times solicited the commentary from Senator Cotton. And while it's unpopular, I take a strong position for the First Amendment. And I believe that the Times was within its rights and properly published an opinion that I bitterly disagree with. And I usually bitterly disagree with Bret Stephens, who is one of the op-ed columnists at the New York Times, but today we are singing the same song. He writes, "Last week's decision by this newspaper to disavow an op-ed by Senator Cotton is a gift to the enemies of a free press." He said it's an invitation to injustice. He says, "I don't agree with Cotton's view. I know of nobody at the Times who does agree with it." Ditto for much of the mainstream media, at least its more liberal precincts. But he said, "Isn't this how we got into trouble in 2016 with our rock-solid belief and possibly win?" Then he notes that a poll by ABC News found that 52% of Americans favored deploying troops to quell violent unrest in American cities. So Cotton isn't representing a political fringe, and he's also not a nobody. And, like Bret Stephens, I agree that people need to know what he thinks, if only to decide that they don't support him. He says the value of the op-ed doesn't lie in its goodness or its rightness. It lies in the fact that Cotton is a leading spokesman for a major current of public opinion. To suggest our readers should not have the chance to examine his opinions for themselves is to patronize them. To say they should look up his opinions elsewhere, say on Twitter, is to betray the responsibility as a newspaper of record. And to claim that his argument is too repugnant for publication is to write off half of America. So, these days make for strange bedfellows, I will say that. Every day I remind you that we are funded in the Peter B. Collins Podcast Community Fund, and we are inviting people to apply for $100 grants to help you get through the tough times that are upon many of us. And today's applicant is Joseph Havson. He says, "Peter, I'm writing regarding your $100 help fund. I'm a jazz piano player who's been listening to you since the early 2000s when you were on KGO. I never miss a podcast." Well, thank you, Joseph. "I've really been struggling to make ends meet since the pandemic began. I could use all the help I can get. I can't seem to find another place on your website to contact you." Well, you got the right place here. "Regarding your fund for helping folks out with a $100 grant. So here I am. Keep up the great work, and thanks for keeping us well informed, and thanks for offering a fellow like me a little help during these hard times." Well, I want to say, Joseph, that you and yesterday's grant to Lee Potter, you're both working musicians, and there are no venues for you to perform. And you may not have the brand of a Lady Gaga or any of the people who've been on some of the TV gigs. And while some people have attempted to do, essentially pay-per-view performances online, I haven't seen anybody hauling in cash hand over fist trying to do that. So I want to use Joseph and Lee as examples. I'll bet there are other musicians who are listening. I'm thinking of Tom Weber in Milwaukee, who have been denied the career that they have chosen, at least for the foreseeable future. So, Joseph, will be sending you a check or a PayPal transfer. I haven't heard back from you on which you prefer, by the end of the day today. And if there are any other struggling musicians who listen to this podcast, get in touch. Email Peter at peterbcollins.com, and I'll be happy to help you with the support of our listeners who've been very generous in contributing to the community fund. So, as I mentioned yesterday, the impact of the George Floyd protests really is heard worldwide. And in Canada today, they are wrestling with the obvious racism that is applied to Indigenous people who are called First Nation in Canadian parlance. And the CBC broadcast a video last night of an incident in northern Alberta where Alan Adam, the chief of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, was questioned by the police after they stopped him over an expired license plate. He ended up charged with assaulting a police officer and resisting arrest, but when you see the picture of his face with a huge scar down the right-hand side and an eye that is barely open because it is so swollen, it's hard to imagine that that stemmed from a license plate issue. Now, Chief Adam has said that a police officer approached his pickup truck about the expired tag. He got agitated after the officer tried to manhandle his wife into arrest. He jumped out of his truck shouting, "Leave my wife alone." Now, it appears from the video, I haven't seen it, that the officer seems to de-escalate the situation. They're about to leave when the cop returns to the driver window and the chief gets out of his truck again. That's when the officer tries to handcuff him and another Mountie rushes into the scene and tackles Mr. Adam. Not only Canada, the long simmering history of racial tensions in Australia have been brought forward by the George Floyd response here in the United States. And according to The Guardian, the record shows that since 1991, 437 Indigenous people, they're called Aborigines in Australia, have died in custody. And the Indigenous account for 28% of people in prison. Their life expectancy is 10 years less than the general population. And I'm reminded of the song by Midnight Oil. I believe it's from 1987 or 88. Beds Are Burning. I think a lot of people know that pop song. Peter Garrett, the lead singer and songwriter, said, "It belongs to them. Let's give it back." But very little has occurred in the meantime to address the great disparities and the mistreatment of Indigenous people in Australia. Back here in the U.S., John Bolton is courageously moving forward to publish the book that he says he would have offered testimony similar to the impeachment process over the Ukraine shakedown that occurred earlier this year. But he was a coward then, and in a press release that has been issued saying that they're naming the publication date of June 23rd for his new book, that the Democrats committed impeachment malpractice by focusing their inquiry on Ukraine. The press release from Simon & Schuster reads, Trump's Ukraine-like transgressions existed across the full range of his foreign policy, and Bolton documents exactly what those were and attempts by him and others in the administration to raise alarms about them. Well, this is so disgusting, because he is now going to publish a book and make a boatload of money But he didn't defend the Constitution. He didn't willingly come forward and testify before the House committees. And by the time the issue got to the Senate, Mitch McConnell and his lackeys in the Republican Party, in my view, broke the Constitution by failing to honor the need for additional investigation and testimony, particularly from people like Bolton, who had teased and tipped that he had information that the Senate should know about in conducting its trial. And so we are the losers in the publication of the almost 600-page book, The Room Where It Happened, a White House memoir. Oh, and there's another book. This is a gossipy book coming out from a Washington Post reporter, Mary Jordan. And she says that First Lady Melania spent the first part of 2017 remaining at Trump Tower in New York. And the cover story was that she didn't want to interrupt her son Barron's school year. And I say her son because Trump refers to Barron as her son. But the big gossip item that surfaces so far is that Melania delayed her move to the White House because she was renegotiating her prenuptial agreement. Yes, a transactional relationship, and that's obvious to anyone who cares to look. Well, the continuing saga of Mike Flynn, the effort of Bill Barr, the Attorney General, to dismiss the charges of perjury against Flynn. The latest is that the federal appeals court that had told the trial judge, Emmett Sullivan, to explain why he hadn't yet dismissed the charges, held oral arguments today, and they seemed persuaded by the advocate for Judge Sullivan that he is within his rights to examine the call by the Attorney General to withdraw the charges. And so we don't have a decision from this appeals panel yet. But based on the account of Charlie Savage, who's a credible reporter at the New York Times, the three judges each asked tough questions about why the decision of Judge Sullivan should not be allowed to go forward at the trial court process. And two of the judges, one appointed by Poppy Bush, the other by Trump, have been quite favorable to the Trump administration in other cases, but they expressed sharp skepticism in the oral argument today. There's another legal case that probably won't get much coverage, but is noteworthy because of the dismissal of the charges due to repeated prosecutorial misconduct. This was the case of an Iranian banker who was accused of violating sanctions. His name is Ali Sadr Hashemi Najad, and he was convicted in March of this year. But the federal judge, Allison Nathan, called on the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York, which handled the case, to submit detailed information to the court about individual government attorneys and their supervisors who had made false statements to the court in the case and other allegations of prosecutorial misconduct. Now, there is no mechanism to hold to account prosecutorial misconduct at the federal level. Some states are trying to develop mechanisms for that, but so far they operate with virtual impunity. So at the heart of the conviction were claims by the government that Sadr had created a network of front companies and bank accounts to mask Iranian business dealings with Venezuela. Well, I think that is noteworthy, and that kind of misconduct occurs more often than people would like to believe. Here's today's COVID-19 update, and you can't blame this on Linda Lewis. She took the day off, and I really appreciate her consistent submissions here to the show to help me on a daily basis. In Chicago, at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, They conducted a lung transplant for a woman in her 20s whose lungs had failed while she was on a ventilator due to the coronavirus. A 10-hour surgery was more difficult, took several hours longer than most lung transplants because inflammation from the disease had left the woman's lungs completely plastered to tissue around them, the heart, the chest wall, and the diaphragm. The doctor said she's awake, she's smiling, she FaceTimed with her family, but she's not out of the woods. She's still on a ventilator because even though the transplanted lungs are healthy, her long illness has left her chest muscles too weak for breathing. Now, this is a pretty rare event, but I salute the doctors for doing everything they can to extend the life of this woman, and I hope that she fully recovers. The Center for Disease Control has issued new guidelines strongly suggesting the use of face masks, and they're not allowed to go much further than that because Trump has basically muzzled the leading public health agency in our country. Other headlines: Oregon Governor Kate Brown announced a one-week pause of reopening plans after 177 new cases of COVID-19 and 2 deaths were reported in Oregon on Thursday. It's one of 11 states that reached its highest 7-day rolling average of new coronavirus cases this week. You remember Rebecca Jones? She got fired by the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, because she said she had been ordered to cook the data so that DeSantis could reopen Florida. Well, you can find her data now at floridacovidaction.com. She is not going to be silenced. So the issue of wearing masks has led to death threats and the resignation of the health director in Orange County here in California. And her name is Dr. Nicole Quick. She resigned on Monday after being ordered to rescind the county regulation that required people to wear masks in public. And her resignation led to the immediate appointment of Dr. Clayton Chow. And the Board of Supervisors in the county objected to any extension of the mask regulation. And dancing around that, Dr. Chow said, "I want to be clear, this doesn't diminish the importance of face coverings." But he does not have the authority or the support of the elected officials there to, hold firm on that. Then we have the case of Amy Acton, who has been the top health official in the state of Ohio. And she resigned yesterday. She was praised by Governor Mike DeWine, but she faced harsh and sometimes ugly pushback for her orders that contributed to the closing of businesses, kept people home for weeks, and she was the defendant in lawsuits, and protests outside her home included some people who were carrying guns. So this aggressive set of attacks on public health officials. And I know there's some people who think that the masks are, meaningless and just a way of forcing people to submit. I am persuaded that wearing a mask prevents me from coughing or sneezing or otherwise aerosolizing any germs that I may be carrying. In Washington, D.C., they published new data today that shows that 3 out of every 4 deaths in the district have been African Americans. As the count reached 506 fatalities, 375 are black people, 65 Hispanic, 54 have been white. You may have heard about this, but Trump is holding a rally in Tulsa on Juneteenth. It's as if they wanted to see just how offensive they could be to African Americans at this sensitive time. But to attend the rally, you have to have a ticket. And to get the ticket, you have to agree to a liability waiver that explicitly says you can't hold the Trump campaign responsible if you come away from the rally with an infection or at least a positive exposure to COVID-19. And I'll bet the rally will be full of people who are willing to sign that waiver to show their loyalty to their fearless tweeter. The Trump administration is scrambling a little bit because they used the pretext of the health emergency to virtually shut down all legal immigration and asylum process to this country. So they are proposing a fallback for when they need to lift the emergency closure rules, proposing regulations that would raise the standard of proof for migrants hoping to obtain asylum, and allow immigration judges to deny applications for protection without giving migrants an opportunity to testify in court. I mean, who cares if their lives are at risk? Why do we need to have a process to hear their sob stories? That's the attitude of this government, and I'm disgusted by it. Asylum is an element of our Constitution, and it shows the deep contempt that our illiterate president holds for the contract we have with our government. We all know what a mess the primary election in Georgia was earlier this week, and in a front-page story in Friday's New York Times, they mostly blame it on the new voting machines that were installed, some at the last minute, described as very complicated. They're ballot marking devices. They require a verification card that the voter carries or receives at the polling place, and they were an abject failure. And David Daley, who's been on this podcast many times, he's the expert on redistricting. And by the way, he does have a new book out called Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. And David has an op-ed published today at The Guardian. And he said those interminable lines wrapped across Atlanta and many other minority counties, the waits almost as long as a workday, making a mockery of any notion of free and fair election. Well, more than 200 precincts across Georgia, disproportionately in minority counties, have been ordered closed since Chief Justice Roberts and the U.S. Supreme Court cast aside protections that have prevented states and localities with a history of racial prejudice in voting laws from changing their electoral rules without federal oversight. But, Daley says, it wasn't just in-person voting that malfunctioned on Tuesday. It was also impossible to watch Georgia's expanded vote-by-mail system melt down, forcing tens of thousands of voters who requested but never received absentee ballots to either join those long lines at the polls or forfeit their civic voice. And he says this predicts a train wreck this fall. Many of the problems we face involve intentional voter suppression, like the surgically focused voter ID bills, precinct closures, and voter roll purges. And the new voting machines had been tested in 6 rural counties in local elections last December. They were described as confusing and producing widespread delays. And I heard Stacey Abrams interviewed on television last night explaining that she got her absentee ballot in the mail, but the specially designated or printed return envelope was already sealed shut. And so she had to, despite her intention to vote by mail, go to a precinct and line up like everybody else. The Biden campaign is launching an initiative with a petition drive to try to shame Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg into taking steps to rein in misinformation, disinformation, and Trump's untruthful tweets and Facebook posts. We'll see how that goes, but Facebook does seem to be a ripe target these days. And at The Intercept, Lee Fung describes a sales meeting that was held by Facebook earlier this week to promote a new product called Facebook, Facebook Workplace. And it's basically a competitor to Slack. That's kind of an intranet email and messaging system. So on Facebook Workplace, employees see a stream of content like a news feed with automatically generated trending topics based on what people are posting about. And one of the new tools debuted by Facebook allows administrators to remove and block certain trending topics among employees. That's censorship. And the presentation discussed the benefits of content control. And one example offered, if the keyword unionize pops up, well, an administrator is flagged and can remove that before the peasants who work for him or her can see it. So the idea that Facebook is actively building tools designed to suppress labor organizing has caused a bit of an uproar at the Menlo Park headquarters. Facebook employees sparked a flurry of posts denouncing the feature, with several commenting in disbelief that the company would overtly pitch unionize as a topic to be blacklisted. A couple of other items for your attention. In another arrogant statement of American exceptionalism, the Trump administration has announced sanctions on individuals who work at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Now, the U.S. has never recognized this body. We didn't sign the treaty, and we refuse to submit to its jurisdiction. And at issue are charges of war crimes, rape, and other violence in Afghanistan. And Mike Pompeo, who does arrogant pretty well, said, when our own people do wrong, we lawfully punish those individuals, as rare as they are. We hold our own accountable better than the ICC has done for the worst perpetrators of mass criminal atrocities. That's rich, quite rich. Again, saluting Alan McLeod, a great reporter at Mint Press News. He brings us new details showing that the U.S.-backed coup against Bolivian President Evo Morales, who won re-election in November, but the Organization of American States declared that it was fraudulent without any evidence. Well, we're learning that the architects of the coup may be in Brazil, because the presidential jet was not available to Evo Morales on the day that he was pushed out of power. Instead, it was in Brasilia, the capital of Brazil. The Bolivian jet made 25 separate visits to Brazil, and that's since the coup, and has not visited any other country. So I think it's very interesting. Earlier this week, the New York Times admitted that the basis for supporting the coup was completely false. But it don't matter anymore. Over in Israel, Netanyahu's grand plan to annex large portions of the West Bank has hit another obstacle. We've reported to you that Israeli settlers are now opposed to it, that the Palestinians are breaking off relations with Israel, such as they are. And now it's a group of Arab nations. The latest is the United Arab Emirates. Its diplomat to the United States, Youssef al-Otaiba, published a column in Hebrew in a leading Israeli newspaper saying that the annexation will lead to a breach between Israel and the Arab world, and those relations have been warming. And Israel has calculated that the Arabs need Israel more than they need the Palestinians, and they want to force them into that choice. But this increasing Arab opposition includes Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. So we'll see how all of that plays out. And finally today, over your weekend, I want to recommend that you drop by thegrayzone.com, because Max Blumenthal and his crew have 2 articles up in recent days which expose Wikipedia. And first, Wikipedia essentially blacklisted the gray zone because anybody can be an editor at Wikipedia. And as the pair of articles point out, a lot of partisans who have a biased interest volunteer to perform the editing, and Wikipedia doesn't do anything about it. So the gray zone has essentially been blacklisted, described as a deprecated media outlet, and Gray Zone points out they have never had to retract an article in the 4 years that they've been in existence, or even issue a major correction. So that by itself is alarming. And then Max and Ben Norton wrote a lengthy piece which exposes the corporate and government connections of the top people at Wikipedia. Jimmy Wales is the founder and the CEO. They get funding from Google, Microsoft, Apple, and Craigslist. They have $145 million in assets, and yet it appears to be like an operation from somebody's garage. So Jimbo Wales is a conservative libertarian. He has kissed up to our government, offering them help. And Wikipedia clearly is influenced by government actors. Then the what is she now? She's like the general manager, Catherine Maher. And her history is fascinating. Goldman Sachs, Council on Foreign Relations, Eurasia Group, HSBC, the bank with a criminal money laundering history based in Britain. Then she worked for UNICEF, overseeing projects funded by USAID. Then she jumped to the National Democratic Institute, directly financed by the U.S. government. And then her last stop before she came to Wikipedia was at the World Bank. So those are the people who set the tone and the policies that permit Wikipedia to be used and abused by many operators who want to prevent any kind of negative commentary from reaching the general public. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the world. Even put it up on Wikipedia. You'll find it on YouTube. I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until